Morning, everyone. Glad to be here. This talk is not about answers. It's about questions. How to think about questions, how to answer questions, how to take a step sideways to think about questions in ways that, well, we might not have. And the type of questions I'm going to be talking about are the questions that we have to address when we look at phenomena that look like this, where we have social trends that affect our students, our faculty, our institutions, intersecting with, colliding with, joining up with the results of what happens when we look at new educational technologies. What happens when new technologies come to the forefront, when they start changing the rules of the game, when we can't ignore them, when we want to incorporate them. And notice I've called the result of this pivot points. The reason I use a term like pivot point rather than calling them challenges or opportunities or crises is that sometimes they can be all of the above. They can be whichever one of those you like according to how you're looking at it, how you're thinking about them. But when one of these pivot points comes about, there are some things you need to be careful about. You need to be careful about the temptation to become too enamored of the focus that's being provided for you by the technology. So that, for instance, let me show you an example. That was the one that got me thinking about this issue in the way I'm about to show you. In the past year, with the advent of MOOCs and several other associated phenomena, there were a lot of discussions, not just in the popular press or some of the technical discussions, but also in sites, journals, groups, conferences, devoted to thinking deeply about what happens with higher education and with K-12, that got into the whole issue of, well, is this possible because of the whole question of, well, we have assessment, we have exams as assessment, what are we going to do about this? And some people coming forward and saying, look, this can't go forward, or it's got to be very limited, and the potential for MOOCs is very limited, particularly when you look on the international stage, because how do we know that the person that is answering that exam is the person that took the course, right? That's a crucial issue. That's a question of authentication. And what do we do about this? And the answer you tended to see very often was from people also in these communities, also in these forums, who have, oh, no problem. We'll just make a digital version of a passport. We have all the technology we need to provide e-authentication. We can take this question, and there really isn't an issue here. We don't need to think about this. You're worrying too much about something that, yes, it changes things. It changes how we think about practices. It changes what we'll do. But at the end of the day, technology solves it for us. Something bothered me about this. Something bothered me about this because, okay, why was the question always being framed in these two terms? One that assumed that whatever the product of the technology, whatever was happening, was going to look an awful lot like that bubble sheet I have there in the back. And the other that also took that as a given, as something to take for granted, and that said, well, okay, we'll just authenticate, and we'll use the technology for that. And for me, it's a question of, wait a second, there's a deeper question here. There's a deeper question that we need to be asking. There's a deeper question that we need to be asking about, is this what we want to look at moving forward? What does assessment mean? Why do we want to do this? How do we want to connect assessment with certification? Lots of deep questions. And the interesting thing to me was that after seeing this crop up once, twice, 3 times, a dozen times, 2 dozen times, the discussion always tended to focus on the technological challenge, the technological answer, without any real consideration of what was happening behind it. Now, these weren't thoughtless people. These were, in fact, people that had thought very deeply about this type of issue. So I knew that it wasn't a question of, well, they've never thought about this type of thing, but very clearly there was a type of fascination, also fear focused on the technology that was keeping the thinking from going deeper, from pushing harder. Now, this shouldn't be a surprise to us. Don Ivy's research has, for several decades now, identified exactly these aspects. Looking at technology, people become focused on the ampliative or reductive aspects of technology. What's the technology enable versus what does it block off? Fascination, fear, self-explanatory, and embodiment otherness, where the technology either becomes embodied in the person of an expert or becomes other in the person that is distant from it, and a focus action shift related to what the technology makes possible or bars. Take all of these 4 items together, and of course you have the basis for saying, I can see where people would become focused on the technological rather than the fundamental questions. Great. So we could say, okay, so let's get Don Ivy into everybody's hand, let's make everybody self-aware of this, and that'll solve the issue, right? Sorry, no. I've tried it. I'm not speaking here as a hypothetical. I've been doing this for a few decades now, and Don Ivy helps. But you still need something to help people get their minds on another track. You need something that's going to help people say, okay, so how do I get away from the technology, but not so far away that I start to lose why the technology comes into the picture in the first place? And that's what I'm going to be talking about, because we start out with this intersection that leads to a pivot point, and I can say, well, okay, part of the problem is I've become too fascinated from whichever angle with the technology. I've become too distant from some of the deep questions I should be asking. What can I do? Well, suppose that I take the technology and I say, let me take it and go back to deep origins. Step away from the specifics of a particular technology, but instead look at what's really behind. What are the key elements? What are the core elements? What are the elements that define the fundamental aspects of what a technology brings to the table? At that point, I've abstracted those elements that Don Ivy identifies as being the distraction points, and I can nonetheless retain those deep origins, because after all, I do have the technology converging to the pivot point. Taking it all together out of the picture is no solution whatsoever. I say, okay, now let me look at that pivot point, however I'm constructing it, whether as a challenge, an opportunity, a crisis point, what have you, and then refract it through the lens of these deep origins. Say, when I take this and I look at it from the lens of not the technology as it exists specifically, but rather the deep origins that underlie the technologies that we'll be looking at, can we get back then to some core principles? Can we get back to phrasing this in terms of the type of questions that instead of blocking further discussion, that instead of saying, well, we'll just keep it where it was and we'll just focus on the technology, open up the landscape. Get us to start asking the what-if questions that are not just wide open, what if, but no particular connection, but what-ifs that are grounded in this refraction of that pivot point through those deep origins of the technologies. Lovely idea. But where do we get those deep origins? Well, those of you who were here last year are going to see a very familiar slide come up next. You look at this and you say, wait, you're thinking about refraction, you're thinking about constructing a lens. What does that lens look like? This is what the lens can look like. This is what I presented last year at this meeting, which said, well, look, let's take all of those technologies that we've identified over a decade of the Horizon report, and let's use them as a basis for finding key categories, a parsimonious set of categories, such that they encompass everything that fundamentally describes them at the core level. And I won't repeat the whole thing because, as I say, many of you were here then, but if you're interested, the video is on YouTube, so you can watch the whole discussion. The bottom line is that 5 categories suffice to describe every one of these technologies that have been core, highly promising, with highly powerful potential in education, And those 5 categories that suffice to categorize, to describe everything, also correspond to key fundamental events, key fundamental moments in the process of how we come to be who we are today as humans. So starting out 200,000 years ago, when we developed the structures for sociality, for interacting with each other, for doing things together, for building bigger projects together. Mobility, about 70,000 years ago, when courtesy of a rather large volcanic eruption, we all had to get on the move, because otherwise, no food to be found. You have a rather short ending if that's the case. So then we developed the technologies, the ways of thinking about technology, the ways of using technology that allow us to be on the move. Visualization, about 40,000 years ago, when we started taking concepts, abstract notions, like the notion of beauty, the notion of space, the notion of time, and making them concrete in visual objects that will allow us to play with those ideas, to work with them further, to share them, to develop them further. Storytelling, and here I'm talking about physical storytelling, about 17,000 years ago. And as Joe and I both used this image from Lescaut, but Lescaut is a very powerful instance of physical storytelling. This is not just oral storytelling. This is storytelling in which the space that the story inhabits, the objects in that space. Lescaut wasn't just paintings on a wall. It's a space that had objects as well that constituted part of the narrative, where that space, where those objects, where the paintings, where all the depictions, where those elements taken from different visualizations all come together to tell a story. And we find, of course, the analog today in digital storytelling, but this type of physical storytelling is something we've been doing for many years. As Joe was pointing out earlier, it's something we're very good at and something that we can leverage very effectively. And finally, gaming, the youngest of the lot, about 8,000 years. When we take that idea of play that we all have and we say, well, how do we take some ideas from visualization and storytelling, run them through the lens of play, and then out of that, drive them via the idea of a game where you can win, to explore further, to develop further, to create a place where new ideas can be explored safely as a way of generating innovation. All right, so we have these 5 categories. And in the past year, I've been using this both to understand and analyze technologies. I've also been using them to generate a lexicon, a catalog to discuss with teachers in K-12, faculty in colleges and universities, ways of selecting technologies. But now I'm going to claim that I can use them as this lens that we will refract those pivot points through. And I'm going to do this with an actual example. So here's the pivot point I'm going to be choosing. The idea of what constitutes that sequence of courses that leads to a degree, that leads to a diploma, that constitutes a course of study. This is a big pivot point right now. It's a big pivot point because we have a confluence of different phenomena. We have a confluence of the opening up of technologies to different places, to different modes of learning. We have the confluence of shifts societally, where we're beginning to see a push societally, particularly in K-12, away from traditional, well, here's grade 1, grade 2, etc., more towards competencies-based learning, where we're looking at individual features. And that's great, but the question then becomes, what does this look like at the end? Is it going to be a series of checkboxes, except that we now took all the courses online, except in face-to-face, or is something else going to happen? And again, I find that this is one of those places where if you're not careful, you can block the discussion. But let's use some ideas from the category of storytelling, because I was telling you about Lescaut. And Lescaut is an amazing space. It's a physical space. So if we're talking about units, elements, competencies that might be picked up along the way, what if instead of thinking about them as just a rote sequence, a rote lineal sequence, like we've usually thought about them, what if we think about them in the idea of a space, how these elements evolve within a space for storytelling, whether if they become the elements of a story, but this story is complex. We need to provide an infrastructure. We need to provide a way to look at it that is focused based upon aspects of, perhaps, the physical space. Now, I'm not saying, okay, let's have all of our students go out and paint caves as a way of telling their story, But I am saying, when we're thinking about this question, when we're thinking about what can be done, when we're thinking about what might happen, think about this. Think about how a story space, in Lascaux, every part of the story has a reason for being there. The final scene, the death scene, is in the hardest part to get out of the cave after you've gone through other places that take you through a story. Think about how that physical space contributes, creates coherence in the narrative. What does this tell us then, if we're thinking now back about that pivot point, about what might happen, what we might do to have this type of transcript that is a story based upon the type of thinking we do in physical storytelling? And what's more, we need to incorporate complexity, because even Lascaux, even as it is still a relatively simple space. So here's Autun in France, the Cathedral of Autun. And when you go to Autun, you have a beautiful example of the cathedral as narrative, the cathedral as story. The illustrations, according to tradition, arguable whether they're all by him, but that were created by Gislebertus for the cathedral, all follow narrative structures based upon that physical space. So this is what you see when you approach the cathedral. But then you start noticing that every single element is in a division in two parts, where there's a counterpoint between what you see on the left, in this case, those people that are to be saved, and those that are to be doomed. So you see at every stage that there is a place where the physical space girds, underwrites how the story develops. Same thing within. But the story actor is even a little bit more complex. It's what I call, hey, look behind you. It's the hey, look behind you structure, because the counterpoint between an Old Testament story, the New Testament story that is its counterpart, or the beginning or the end of a story, is involved in turn around. What do you see on the pillar behind you? And again, think about this. As you think about this problem, as you think about this pivot point, as you think about this opportunity or challenge, what do you bring in? What do you do with the technology such that something like this, of this complexity and richness, could be in the system? Does it look like your current transcript systems? Don't you want to step aside from it? Also think about another aspect. Let's use a different lens. There I use physical storytelling. Now let's use a social aspect. This is from the work done by Corina Picella with the Hadza people. And what she's looked at is the question of how complex is Hadza social networking society. The Hadza is hunter-gatherer society. What does this look like relative to where we started? The answer is, it looks exactly like it does in a society today for us. The complexity of one is the same as the others, and one of the key things, what are the means of communication between the different groups? Well, it turns out that the key mean of communication that establishes bonds, that says how do you create ways of working in this society, is through gifts. Okay? So we're thinking about the question of that transcript, of that course, but if we're talking about people negotiating, creating jointly in that space through gifts, what could the gifts look like? And it turns out that we can take a structure created for us by Unsworth, where we say, well, there are 7 scholarly primitives that all scholarly pursuits have in common, and these can be the token for a gift economy that underlies what we want to do. So these are 2 lenses that I've taken, one through digital storytelling in the persona of physical storytelling, the other one through the social, that can be used to rethink, reconceptualize this point. So at the end of the day, as I said, this is not a talk about answers, it's a talk about questions. But there's always a hope. And my hope is that, for instance, for this particular issue, the answer might not look like this, but rather look like this. This is the oldest calendar and map and story associated in the world from ancient Babylon. It brings together all 5 of those dimensions I talked about in a rich object that tells a rich story that allows us to step beyond the limits of a technology and get new things. Thank you.